Discover the tips and strategies that will help you achieve your retirement goals. I'm your host, James Knoll, and this is the podcast dedicated to helping you retire well. It all starts right here on Ready for Retirement. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ready for Retirement. I'm your host, James Knoll. We have an issue today, or a question today, about an issue that I've been thinking a lot about wanting to do a podcast on because this question comes up over and over again. There's just a lot of details to it. So enough questions have come through, and I think it'll be very helpful. Today, we're going to be talking about how do you prioritize between health insurance subsidies versus Roth conversions. Both of those are planning points that you should be considering at about the same time, or at least at similar times. There's a lot of overlapping times where those issues could come into play. And the question for a lot of people is, how do I understand which to prioritize? This question directly came from a listener named Ben, and Ben said this, and I'm editing this for brevity, but his question is this. He says, I'm single and retired at age 54. I took the full 18 months of COBRA coverage before starting on an ACA healthcare plan in 2019. I have been using the assets in my non-retirement brokerage account to fund my living expenses. I've been cautious not to realize too high of a capital gain and therefore hit the insurance subsidy cliff. The ACA income limits were raised in 2020 and 2021 because of the CARES Act, and the additional subsidy amounts have helped to knock down my monthly premiums. But the cliff still exists, and the full price for bronze level, zero deductible healthcare plan that includes my preferred provider is substantial. It's over $900 per month for 2022. He then goes on to say, my portfolio has grown substantially since I retired, and now I'm at the point where I feel like I may be cheating myself out of a higher quality of life since I'm limiting what I can spend on travel, life experiences, upgrading my housing situation, etc., in exchange for keeping my health insurance costs lower. I haven't wanted to pay full price for a healthcare plan after transitioning off of COBRA and onto an ACA plan. My question is, how can one weigh the pros and cons of going over the subsidy cliff and paying the full price for a healthcare plan? All right, Ben. Well, thank you very much for that question. And just to quickly summarize what Ben is asking. So ACA, if you don't know, it stands for the Affordable Care Act. And what he's asking is, I have this portfolio. I'm intentionally keeping my income low to qualify for ACA or Affordable Care Act health insurance premium subsidies. But I kind of feel like I'm cheating myself. If I'm doing all this work to keep my health insurance premiums low, but in order to do so, my portfolio just continues to grow. And I feel like I'm limiting myself in my ability to do some things. I think directly, my answer would be, you certainly might be. And you just have to ask yourself the question, let's say you just continue this trajectory. Let's say you successfully keep your premiums low until Medicare age. Well, what that means is pulling less from your portfolio for the next several years. So your income stays lower, but you're also foregoing a lot of the experiences that my guess is you were looking forward to in your retirement. So keep that trajectory going. And if you do so, how much will you have in your portfolio 20 years from now, 25 years from now, 30 years from now? If it's more than you could ever spend or give or use, then you have to ask yourself, what was the cost of saving all that money on health insurance premiums? Because the goal of financial planning isn't to see how can I die with the most amount of money and how can I keep my costs as low as possible every single year. It's how can you use your money to get the most out of life? So that's part one, my kind of first feedback towards Ben's question. But I'm going to spin this question a little bit more into something else I see quite a bit, and it's something I mentioned at the beginning, which is, do you use the years in your tax planning window? So I'll explain more what that means in a second, but it's the time between retirement and when Social Security and required distributions kick in. Do you use those years in your tax planning window to keep income low to qualify for health insurance premiums? Or do you keep income low to free up the ability to do Roth conversions at a lower tax bracket? So that is going to be the topic for today's episode. Before we jump in too much, though, I want to highlight the review of the week. This comes from Beth VA. She gave a 5-star review, and she said, James's podcast is fantastic. He takes a clear, pragmatic, and honest approach to discussing retirement options and strategies using a variety of case studies to see things through varied perspectives. The best. Well, thank you very much, Beth VA, for that 5-star review. Really appreciate reading those. If you have not already done so, please take a quick minute to leave a review either on iTunes or on Spotify. Spotify, you can now just leave stars. You can't leave a comment, but you can leave a 5-star review on Spotify. If you want to leave a comment, you can do that on iTunes, and I really appreciate you doing that. So with that said, let's jump into the episode today. And I want to build up a general sense of how do we look at this? This can be a pretty complicated topic. So I want to paint a picture here of how we even want to think about looking at this. The first thing to understand is what a tax planning window is. What a tax planning window is the period of time that you'll have a lower income, or at least the option of creating a lower income. And it's typically between the time that you retire and the time that Social Security kicks in, potentially at 70, and required distributions kick in at 72. So think of it this way. Let's assume that you're working. When you're working, you have some income from your salary or bonuses or commissions or however you get paid. Whatever way you get paid, though, there's typically some high base level of income that's going to put you in some marginal tax bracket. And for many people, it's going to be between 22% and 37% at the federal level. So if your taxable income for 2022 is above $83,550, you are going to be at least in the 22% tax bracket. And that goes from 22 to 24 to 32 to 35 to 37. So at a minimum, if you're over that taxable income amount, you're at 22. And at the maximum, you're at 37, at least as tax brackets stand today. Well, that's what it looks like when you're working. Then you retire. And if you retire, maybe you have some money in an IRA, maybe you have some money in a Roth IRA, maybe you have some money in a brokerage account. You have different options for where you can pull funds from, and you can be very intentional about how you pull funds from your retirement portfolio. So this is the beginning of your tax planning window. Your income floor, which used to be comprised of your salary or bonus or things like that, your income floor, at least for a lot of people, gets much lower. Now, things like pension or rental income or other income types like that could potentially throw this off a little bit, but your income floor is much lower, and oftentimes you may be able to take funds from your IRA, Roth IRA, brokerage account in such a manner as to keep your tax bracket very low. Sometimes, or many times, between 0 and 12%. So what's happening here is you are in your tax planning window, where as your tax planning or as your income floor is very low, this is where it gives you the option to do a whole bunch of things and do so at a low tax rate. Well, that doesn't last forever. At some point, Social Security is going to kick in. And if you max out your Social Security benefit, that's going to kick in at age 70. And at some point, if you have pre-tax accounts, so IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, other pre-tax accounts like that, at some point your required distributions kick in, and that starts at age 72. And then your required distributions typically go up from there. The percentage certainly goes up. And assuming your portfolio stays the same balance or greater, it goes up too. So that tax planning window, it's the time between the day you retire and the time at which Social Security required distributions kick in. Obviously, those aren't starting at the same exact time, but it's kind of a phase out of your tax planning window, at least one way of thinking about it. So I want to make sure that makes sense so far. Everyone's tax planning window is going to look a bit different. Some people maybe don't necessarily have it, depending upon when they retire or when they start Social Security or depending on their asset types, but that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is this. If you are going to retire before age 65, you have to determine how you're going to pay for health insurance. If you're going to retire before 65, Medicare doesn't kick in until 65. So you're either electing an option like COBRA. You maybe have some health insurance coverage from your old employer, but for a lot of people, it's going out to the marketplace and understanding what health insurance options are available to you. And that's going to be a big expense for most people, is getting health insurance coverage for those years between the time they retire until Medicare kicks in at age 65. Here's the thing to note with this. If your household income is less than 400% of the federal poverty level, then you qualify for a health insurance subsidy. Now, if you're married in 2022 and you have a household size of 2, the federal poverty level is $18,310. 400% of that is $73,240. That's a family of 2. So if your family is larger or smaller, if you're single, that number is going to be different, but just use it as a starting point. And one very important thing to note is there's a cliff penalty. So if you go even $1 above that amount, you lose the entire subsidy. But if you keep your income below that amount, you qualify for what can be a potentially pretty significant subsidy that helps to keep the cost of your insurance low. Okay? So let's look at this now. We have this tax planning window, and we know that if we're retiring before age 65, we need to come up with a solution for how we're going to pay for medical insurance or health insurance. And those premiums start to look pretty darn attractive when you see how much money that can save you. Okay? Now, here's the hard part. Let's also assume that you run a retirement projection and you run an analysis and you see, oh my gosh, I'm going to get crushed in required distributions or taxes on my required distributions in the future. So I should probably be doing some Roth conversions to mitigate the impact or to manage the impact of my required minimum distributions in the future. Now, that sounds good, but these two strategies could potentially be conflicting. Not potentially, they absolutely are conflicting in many cases. Because of this, Roth conversions increase your taxable income. So Roth conversions increase your taxable income, and your income is what's going to determine your ability to qualify for a subsidy or not. So the question becomes, do you do the Roth conversions and go over the subsidy cliff to offset future taxes? Or do you stay under the subsidy cliff by keeping income low and not doing as much in conversions to save more money on health insurance premiums today? It can become a complicated analysis, but that's what I want to discuss today. Before we jump in, and I'm sorry I'm spending a lot of time painting the picture here before I get into the specifics, I want to first go over when won't this be relevant. I think a lot of people hear stuff on podcasts or they read something or they watch a video and they think, oh my gosh, this is so complicated. How on earth am I supposed to balance all these different details? This is not relevant to everybody. So let me put some people's minds at ease just by saying this might not be an analysis you even have to do. So before getting started, this is not as relevant, number one, if you're retiring after age 65. If you're married and both spouses are 65 or over, this analysis really is a lot more simple for you. You don't need to worry about health insurance premium subsidies. You'll just go on Medicare. So you'll have your Medicare benefit, and sure, there's still some IRMA surcharges or Medicare premium surcharges that you'll pay based upon how much money you're converting from your Roth or how much income you're generating or things like that. But comparatively speaking, at least, it's a much lower impact than the health insurance subsidy analysis. So if you're both retiring at 65 and you're both on Medicare, this analysis isn't going to be as relevant to you because you don't have to worry about staying under certain income amounts to qualify for health insurance premiums. The second general type of person this might not be relevant for is if you just don't have as substantial of an amount in your pre-tax accounts. Unfortunately, there's not a magic number of what constitutes substantial amount in your pre-tax accounts and what doesn't. There's so many different variables that this depends upon. But in general, I'm just going to throw this out there as a very, very rough estimate, not going to be relevant or applicable to everyone. But in general, if your total pre-tax accounts are, say, less than $500,000 or so, and you're approaching retirement, this might not be relevant. If you're between $500,000 and $1 million, then it may or may not be. And if you have over $1 million in your pre-tax accounts, then it's more than likely that this analysis is at least something to pay close attention to. And the reason for that is that balance is what's going to determine your RMDs in the future. It's going to be one of the major things that determines your required minimum distributions in the future. So if you're going into this and maybe you have a couple $100,000 or a few $100,000 in pre-tax accounts and other assets are elsewhere, or that's your only asset to supplement Social Security or pension, you may not even need to worry about this because RMDs might not be an issue for you. So Roth conversions may not be as important for you. So hard to say exactly where that is, but the larger the amount in your pre-tax accounts, the larger the challenge is to manage that growth, because that growth is what's going to lead to your future tax liability in the form of a required minimum distribution. So let's now jump in. And one thing to do to supplement this is there's a blog called FI Physician run by David Graham. That is a great blog post, and it's titled Choosing Between Premium ACA Tax Credits and Roth Conversions. A lot of great information there if you'd like to see this in a written format. But just wanted to give a shout out to that blog because I thought it was a really nice analysis on when does this make sense or not. Now, it's going to depend upon your goals, your income that you want to create, your legacy goals, your charitable intentions, your types of income, how much you have in pre-tax accounts versus other accounts. And as I said, this can get fairly complicated pretty quickly. But what I want to do is simplify this as much as possible. So now that we have a general landscape of when might this type of planning even be relevant, let's look at the way I would approach this, or what's the first thing that I think maybe makes sense to consider when you're trying to understand if you should prioritize qualifying for health insurance subsidies versus should you prioritize Roth conversions. Well, the first thing I would even look at is start with a basic projection of what will your required minimum distribution look like. This, of course, can be a lot easier to do if you have a software, and the software can help you look at the projected balance of your IRAs or 401ks and other pre-tax accounts starting at age 72 and then beyond. And the reason for that is the software will adjust for things like contributions, withdrawals, growth, conversions, et cetera, But if you don't have software that can do this for you, at least get some type of a financial calculator that says, based upon my current pre-tax balances, based upon some assumed growth rate, how much might I have in pre-tax balances by the time I'm age 72? And that's important because the goal of Roth conversions is first and foremost to reduce the impact of RMDs at a later date. So AKA to reduce taxes in the future. So in the future, for a lot of people, it's not necessarily just their IRA or pre-tax account balances that will be the issue. It's going to be those RMDs, the required distributions, that will be an issue because you could potentially be in a position where you're going to be forced to take more out of your accounts than you necessarily need to be able to fund your lifestyle. So the next thing you need to look at, and the reason that running a basic projection on what will your pre-tax balances look like in the future, is to see, are RMDs going to be an issue for you? Now, let's talk about this. What does being an issue mean? There's no clear definition of, is this an issue or is this not an issue? But here's what I'd look at. First, what isn't it? Well, it is not having an RMD. Just having a required minimum distribution is not necessarily an issue. Let's say, for example, you run a projection, and that projection shows you, here's exactly how much money, or here's a guess at how much money you might have at age 72. Well, you can use the IRS Uniform Life Expectancy tables to understand that based upon that balance, how much will your required minimum distribution be? Let's say maybe it's $20,000 or $25,000. Everyone's different, of course, but it's probably not a huge issue. That amount just doesn't have the potential to push you significantly into a much higher bracket than you necessarily need to be in. Now, again, there's some nuance there and some details there. It could be an issue, but probably not a problem for most people. Now, if you 10x that, if you have $200,000 to $250,000 that's coming in as a required minimum distribution, that definitely might be a problem. So it's hard to give absolutes here, but let's start with that as an example. So first, what does being an issue mean? Number one, it's not having an RMD that's an issue, but it's having an RMD that's a substantial amount. And the second piece of this is, will that RMD push you into a higher tax bracket than you'd be in now if you pulled funds from your IRA to meet your living expenses? So for example, let's assume that you run a retirement projection and you retire today. Well, if you were to pull funds from your IRA to live on, and say, for example, that put you in the 12% bracket, but in the future, your RMDs would put you in the 24% bracket, then you can start to see how that might be an issue. You're saying, oh my gosh, I can pull money out today at 12% to either live on or to convert. But in the future, maybe at that point I have Social Security, maybe I've got some other income sources, maybe I also have required distributions, and those required distributions will put me in the 24% bracket. You can start to see how that's an issue. It's a much higher bracket then than it will be for you today. So let's continue with this. Let's assume for a second that you run this basic analysis and RMDs aren't going to be an issue for you. Well, if not, then Roth conversions may not be the most effective thing for you. Going back to that tax planning window that we started with, the tax planning window is those years in which you have a lower taxable income because you can control how you pull funds from your portfolio. So the question is, do we take advantage of that tax planning window to do Roth conversions, which increases income today to save money in the future? Or do we take advantage of the tax planning window and the lower income today to keep income low, which helps us to qualify for a health insurance premium? So if RMDs are not going to be an issue for you in the future, there maybe isn't that need to do Roth conversions, which means there maybe isn't that need to increase your taxable income today, which means it's maybe potentially more beneficial for you to keep your income low to qualify for health insurance subsidies than it would be to make those conversions, which may not actually help you in the long term and which might eliminate your ability to qualify for a health insurance premium today. So to sum that up, and this is absolutely not a black and white rule or a clear-cut rule, but if RMDs aren't going to be an issue for you in the future, meaning they're not going to push you into higher taxable income, it might make sense to prioritize health insurance subsidies today, which means keep income low today by maybe not doing Roth conversions. Now, on the flip side, if RMDs are going to be an issue for you, then the next question is to really understand how much could you save through doing a Roth conversion strategy. Unfortunately, this isn't really something that you can easily do with back of the napkin math. It requires a lot more projection, and typically you're going to use software to do this. But the next question is, how much would you save through a Roth conversion strategy? The nice thing about that is, let's say you run an analysis and you say, you know what, I can save $700,000 to a Roth conversion strategy. And by the way, for a lot of people, that's not exaggerative. If they've got a substantial amount in their pre-tax accounts, and if they've got a relatively early retirement, meaning they're retiring earlier than 70 and have a tax planning window that they can take advantage of, that number is not exaggerative. Oftentimes, people can save hundreds of thousands of dollars through a Roth conversion strategy. Now, if that's the case, let's assume it's $700,000. The next thing is to compare that to your health insurance premium subsidies. Maybe a subsidy saves you $10,000 per year per spouse, for example. So if you're going to retire at age 63, and there's two of you both retiring at 63, well, you could save $10,000 per year per spouse, so $20,000 per year times 2 years until Medicare kicks in. In that basic example, you could save $40,000 by keeping income low to qualify for health insurance premiums, versus you could save a whole lot more money than that through a Roth conversion strategy. So you have to weigh the pros and cons here. You have to weigh the financial impact of each of these. And in that situation, the Roth conversion strategy would save you a whole heck of a lot more money than keeping income low would to qualify for a health insurance subsidy. Now, that's not a fully accurate projection, because if you're going to save that much money on Roth conversions, you're probably continuing to do Roth conversions even after age 65 once you qualify for Medicare. So it's not just those 2 years from 63 to 65 where you're doing the Roth conversions, but you could look at that to say year by year, what's the expected impact of those Roth conversions over the course of your lifetime? And does that exceed the amount that you would save by qualifying for a health insurance subsidy? So that's the first thing I would look at, is to what extent will Roth conversions save you money on taxes in the future, versus to what extent will qualifying for a health insurance subsidy save you in not necessarily taxes, but just save you in costs today. The second thing to note is when you understand the impact of your RMD, the next question is, let's assume, for example, the RMD, they are an issue, or RMDs will be an issue for you and will push you into a tax bracket you don't want to be in. The next question is, could they be mitigated by starting conversions after 65? So again, Medicare kicks in at 65, and at that point, you don't have to worry about the premium subsidy anymore. So if you look at this and say, okay, Medicare kicks in at 65, I don't have to worry about qualifying for a health insurance subsidy anymore. Could I offset the negative impact of RMDs just through using my tax window between age 65 and required distributions? If the answer is yes, then you might be able to get the best of both worlds. Depending on when you retire, can you qualify for a health insurance subsidy those first few years? And what that means is you're probably not doing Roth conversions in those years, or at least you're doing a lot less of them. Could you do that for the first few years until you turn 65? At that point, you qualify for Medicare. And then would you have a long enough time from 65 until age 72 to implement the remaining Roth conversions that you need to do in order to keep your RMDs manageable? So if that's the case, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the health insurance subsidy, and you also still have a long enough time to do some Roth conversions. This is very much a case-by-case basis because everyone's situation is so different. But this is the second thing I would consider, is once we understand if RMDs are going to be issue, number one, we want to understand how much would you save through a Roth conversion strategy as compared to how much would you save through getting a health insurance subsidy. But then number two, start to see, could you get the best of both worlds of the subsidy before 65 and do Roth conversions after 65. The third thing that I would want everyone to look at here is, are you charitably inclined? And that may sound like it has nothing to do with Roth conversions or health insurance subsidies, but it absolutely does. So are you charitably inclined, meaning do you want to do not just any charitable giving, not just a couple $100 here or there, but do you want to do a fairly material amount of charitable giving? This can be a substantial amount to charities. This could be a tithe. This could be money that you're giving that's not really just a couple $100 once or twice a year or so. If you are charitably inclined, and if giving is a big part of what matters to you, what's important to you, who you are, well, then in that case, your RMDs could be fully or at least partially offset through a QCD, so a qualified charitable distribution. So with a qualified charitable distribution, you can gift up to $100,000 per year per person. So if you're married, you could do $200,000 per year each. And what that allows for is that helps you to mitigate the impact of your RMD. Instead of taking your RMD, paying taxes on it, and then gifting the money to a charity, you would simply donate the money directly from your IRA to the charity of your choice. So if that's one of your goals, and that's wonderful, well, now all of a sudden Roth conversions become a little bit less important for you, potentially a lot less important for you, if you plan to do your giving directly from your IRAs after age 72. And really, you can actually do those as early as 70 and a half. But 72 is when they really become impactful because it's allowing you to avoid having to take funds as part of your required distribution. So if that's the case, then you might look more towards taking advantage of health insurance subsidies upfront, because those health insurance subsidies will save you money today, and you also don't have to think about the impact of RMDs in the future, depending, of course, on how much that RMD will be, depending upon how much charitable giving you want to do. But that is something, that's another variable that we would layer on top of this, because if charitable giving is an important part of your plan, that's one way to offset RMDs without having to do Roth conversions, which means you maybe want to focus more on those health insurance subsidies. Now, a second thing is some people, when they're doing Roth conversions, is they want to do so not just for them, but also for their children. They say, if my children inherit these funds or my heirs inherit these funds, I want them to inherit tax-free money. Now, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of letting your children's planning drive your planning, but for a lot of people, it's important to them, which is great to say, I want to have more money in Roth accounts so that when my children inherit this or when my heirs inherit this, it's tax-free money. If that's the case, and if the desire is to leave money to charity and leave money to kids, and ideally leave your tax-free money to kids, then make sure to get your beneficiary designations correct. And what I mean by this is, let's just assume, easy example, maybe you have half of your money in a traditional IRA and half of your money in a Roth IRA, and you want 50% of your inheritance to go to your kids and 50% to a charity, just for example. Well, don't leave half of your Roth to charity and half to kids, and then half of your traditional IRA to charity and half to kids. Leave the full Roth to the kids and have them split that, and then leave the full IRA to charity. The reason for that is charities don't pay any taxes on anything. So whether you leave them regular brokerage accounts or a property or IRAs, they're not paying taxes on that. So might as well leave the pre-tax funds to the charity to fill up the bucket of however much you want to leave to the charity, and then leave the Roth balances, leave the brokerage account balances, leave properties, whatever it is. That's money that's best left to non-charities. So in most cases, children or family, because that's going to either receive a step up in basis or it's going to be in a Roth already and not taxable. So this is still all fairly high level, but that's just a general idea of how I look at it. And in summary, I would say this: Roth conversions have the potential to save you hundreds of thousands of dollars or more in taxes over the course of your lifetime. Not everyone's in a situation where that much money could be saved. It's really only if you have a fairly substantial amount in pre-tax accounts. But Roth conversions have the potential to save you hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes even millions of dollars or more in taxes over the course of your lifetime. So what you do is you convert when you're in a lower tax bracket, let that money compound tax-free, and the end result is lots and lots more tax-free dollars. Well, health insurance premiums, they have the potential to save you tens of thousands, not necessarily in taxes, but in just costs and expenses. Now, you look at that and it's kind of, do I want to save tens of thousands or do I want to save hundreds of thousands? And again, this depends on your situation. For some people, it's going to be neither of those things. But for people who are in this situation, both are going to save you money. For a lot of people, the temptation is to save more money today on health insurance subsidies because they can see the immediate savings. It's $10,000 today, or it's $15,000 today, or it's some substantial amount today. Versus Roth conversions don't save you any money today. In fact, they cost you money today. But over the course of your retirement, the potential savings can be substantial. So I hope that's helpful. I know this was somewhat of an overgeneralization, but there's so many variables that go into this. I would say consult your financial planner, consult your tax planner, do a lot of work on this to really see which of these, if either, would be more beneficial to you between health insurance subsidies and Roth conversions. But unfortunately, this is the only way to really look at this in a 30-minute podcast or so. So thank you very much for that question, Ben. That was very helpful. Thank you to everyone who's still listening. I know this was jam-packed with a lot of details. So appreciate you listening as always. Be sure to check us out on YouTube under Root Financial Partners. Be sure to leave a review if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Ready for Retirement podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe and let me know by leaving a 5-star review. And as always, for a list of the notes and the resources mentioned in today's episode, you can find those at the Ready for Retirement website, which is readyforretirement.co. That's readyforretirement.co. And if you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future episode, then you can also go to the Ready for Retirement website, readyforretirement.co. There's a page called Submit Your Question where you can submit a question for me to answer in a future episode. Thanks as always for listening, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, it's me again for the disclaimer. Please be smart about this. Before doing anything, please be sure to consult with your tax planner or financial planner. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment, tax, legal, or other financial advice.